Okay, let's unpack this. You might think of tariffs as kind of a relic, right? A policy tool from a previous administration that's largely, faded into the background.
Yeah, something maybe we dealt with a few years ago.
Exactly. But as we've been digging through our sources for this deep dive, a very different and frankly far more pressing story has emerged.
Mhm.
These Trump-era tariffs, they are not only still very much alive, they're like a quiet, almost imperceptible hum in the global economy that, well, according to our analysis, could very suddenly become a roar.
A roar, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
So we're diving deep today into a topic that feels like it's been lurking just out of sight, but the approaching deadlines mean it's now demanding our full, urgent attention.
Right. The timing is key here.
Absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is, well, precise: to extract critical insights from the sources about the current relevance of these tariffs, the hidden risks that could make this issue explode onto the global stage.
Yeah, the triggers.
The triggers, exactly.
Yeah.
And the strategic implications for businesses, for investors who are, already grappling with this complex landscape. And finally, the overall macro outlook.
The big picture.
The big picture. This isn't just about catching up on headlines. It's about understanding the deep-seated underlying dynamics that are actively shaping global trade right now, and importantly, what that means for you.
What's truly fascinating here is how these policies, even in what seems like a quieter phase, um, continue to exert such profound and, well, pervasive influence.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at a situation that has the very real potential to trigger significant widespread shifts across various economic sectors. And understanding its nuances is absolutely key, I think, to grasping broader economic trends that will, well, touch almost everyone.
Yeah.
The sheer persistence of these tariffs, despite changes in administrations, shifts in global priorities, it really underscores their deep, almost entrenched roots in current trade policy.
Right.
And their enduring, often overlooked impact on national economies, particularly those heavily reliant on exports. We're not just discussing minor adjustments, around the edges of trade.
No.
We're delving into foundational challenges to how global commerce is conducted, potentially redirecting the flow of goods and capital on a, well, pretty massive scale.
Indeed. And when we talk about these Trump-era tariffs, it's absolutely crucial to grasp that they haven't simply, evaporated.
Not at all.
While they might not be dominating the financial news headlines every single day, our sources consistently emphasize that they remain a constant, albeit often understated, element in the intricate web of global trade dynamics.
Like that hum you mentioned.
Exactly, that hum. This lingering presence is deeply tied to a concept known as reciprocal tariffs. Now, this isn't just some abstract academic idea.
So it's very real.
It's a very tangible and often aggressive mechanism where if one country imposes trade barriers on another's goods, the affected partner can, and often does, respond by, well, erecting equivalent barriers. It creates a kind of economic tit for tat, yeah. A perpetual game of defensive and offensive moves that, as we're seeing now, doesn't necessarily escalate into a full-blown trade war all the time.
Right, it can just simmer.
Exactly, it can simmer. But it can settle into a kind of high-friction equilibrium where every transaction carries an added, often hidden, cost.
Exactly. That concept of reciprocal tariffs, as meticulously detailed in our sources, is truly fundamental to comprehending this ongoing sort of low-grade economic friction. Think of it less as a sudden attack and more like a permanent, almost invisible friction tax on trade.
A friction tax, I like that.
Yeah. If country A places a 25% tariff on widgets from country B is highly likely to respond with a similar tariff on, say, country A's automobiles.
Right. Makes
And
sense.
it's a defensive reflex.
Right.
Designed to level the playing field or maybe pressure for concessions. But the core insight here is that these quiet tariffs aren't just background noise. They're an invisible friction tax that perpetually warps the competitive landscape.
Right.
So even if a specific tariff isn't actively being debated or threatening to escalate into some new crisis, its mere existence necessitates either a direct counter tariff or it just remains a persistent burden on that specific trade relationship. It's an equilibrium, yes, but one built on increased costs and reduced efficiency rather than the free flow of goods.
Yeah, which acts as a constant drag.
A constant drag on the global trade mechanism, yeah. Even when it's not generating dramatic headlines or sparking new political controversies.
And here's where it gets genuinely stark and, frankly, quite impactful, especially for specific regions and the businesses operating within them.
Okay.
These aren't just theoretical lines on a spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
These percentages translate into very real, tangible costs and immense challenges for entire nations, particularly those highly reliant on exports, like several in Southeast Asia.
Right, the ASEAN nations.
Exactly. Our sources detail these astonishingly high reciprocal tariffs that some ASEAN nations are facing when exporting to the U.S. For example, Cambodia is hit with tariffs as high as 49%.
49%, wow.
49. Vietnam isn't far behind at 46%. Thailand faces a 36% tariff, and Malaysia, a significant trading partner, is subject to 24%.
Those are huge numbers.
Just pause for a moment and really think about those numbers. Imagine you're a garment factory owner in Cambodia. Nearly half the value of your finished clothing, once it reaches the U.S. market, could be eaten up by these tariffs.
Devastating.
It dramatically increases the cost of your goods, makes them far less competitive than products from non-tariffed countries or even, domestic U.S. production.
Yeah, it completely changes the economics.
For these highly dependent nations, particularly Cambodia and Vietnam, this translates directly into significant economic vulnerability. We're talking about a sharp reduction in market share, a direct hit to national economies, and a painful impact on employment figures as factories struggle to remain viable or even face closure. While a more diversified economy like, say, Singapore might be, quote, able to cope, the situation for nations like Cambodia and Vietnam is far more precarious. It pushes them to the very brink of economic instability.
And when we connect this to the bigger picture, these percentages aren't merely abstract numbers.
No.
They represent immense, almost debilitating pressure on the economic systems of these nations. It raises a crucial question, doesn't it? How do nations sustain growth, attract foreign investment, provide stable employment for their citizens, when nearly half the potential revenue from their exports to a major global market is just eroded by tariffs?
Right. It's unsustainable long term.
For these economies, trade isn't just a component of their GDP, it's the very engine of their growth.
Absolutely.
Take Cambodia's textile industry, for example. You mentioned garment factories. It's a cornerstone of their economy, employs hundreds of thousands of people. A 49% tariff isn't just an inconvenience.
I know.
It's a direct threat to the livelihoods of entire communities and the government's ability to fund essential services. The impact is profound, forcing immediate and often painful adaptations.
Yeah.
And this stark contrast really highlights the vast differences in economic resilience. Nations with diversified economies, strong domestic consumption, they can absorb such shocks, maybe.
Maybe.
But those heavily reliant on specific export sectors, particularly to the U.S., they face an existential challenge. This isn't just about trade. It's about fundamental economic stability and, the social fabric of these countries.
So what does this all mean for individual businesses navigating this environment? And more broadly for you, if you're looking at investments, trying to understand where capital flows?
Yeah, the practical implications.
It means operating within a landscape where the ground rules can fundamentally shift, like at any moment, and profitability can be severely impacted by external factors completely beyond a company's control.
Total uncertainty.
Exactly. These persistent tariffs, even when not actively escalating, translate into very tangible and significant corporate costs. We're talking increased expenses for sourcing raw materials, higher overall production costs for manufacturers in affected regions, and ultimately a substantial reduction in profit margins for companies that either operate in or source from these exposed territories. Imagine a large tech company. They've meticulously built their entire supply chain around manufacturing components in, say, Vietnam. Now, with a 46% tariff, the cost of those components once they reach U.S. shores skyrockets. This isn't a minor tweak to their budget. It's a massive hit to their bottom line.
Right.
It forces them to reevaluate every single aspect of their production and pricing strategy. They might face the choice of either passing those costs on to consumers,
Which hurts competitiveness.
right, or absorbing the costs.
Which kills profits.
Exactly. Neither is a palatable option, and the constant threat means long-term planning becomes a hazardous gamble.
And the ripple effect across global supply chains is truly profound. Companies are essentially forced into a continuous, often costly, state of reevaluation.
Constantly looking over their shoulder.
Constantly. They're reconsidering their sourcing strategies, exploring alternatives, investing in resilience. This frequently leads to a push for greater diversification, strategically spreading their manufacturing and procurement activities across multiple countries, multiple regions.
De-risking, basically.
De-risking, yeah. Reducing over-reliance on any single origin that might be subject to these tariff shocks. Or, alternatively, some are even considering reshoring, you know, bringing production back home or closer to their primary markets.
Even if it costs more initially.
Even if the direct tariff escalation isn't actively happening right now, the very presence of these tariffs, even if they're currently dormant, introduces a pervasive layer of uncertainty and risk that directly impacts investor sentiment.
Yeah, I bet.
This uncertainty can significantly deter new foreign direct investment, FDI, from flowing into tariff-exposed regions and sectors. It effectively starves them of crucial capital. Instead, that capital might shift to less exposed sectors or, indeed, be reallocated entirely to different regions perceived as more stable, more predictable. It fundamentally alters the risk-reward calculation for anyone looking to invest in or build global supply chains.
So it's not just the direct cost.
No, it's not just a direct financial levy. It's like an invisible tax on certainty and predictability. And that can be just as, if not more, damaging to long-term economic planning.
This risk factor is now like a permanent line item in any serious investor's due diligence.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial and urgent element of our deep dive, the ticking clock, the potential triggers that could transform this quiet hum into that full-blown, ear-splitting roar we talked about.
Right, the flashpoints.
Exactly. Our sources highlight critical approaching deadlines that are, quite frankly, right around the corner, specifically July 8th and 9th.
Wow, that's next week. These aren't distant future dates. They're arriving with incredible speed, forcing immediate action or, well, consequence. What makes this situation even more complex, and frankly quite bewildering, is the conflicting signals emanating directly from Washington itself.
Mixed messages. Always helpful.
Always helpful, yeah. On one hand, you have the U.S. Commerce Secretary, Raimondo, who stated back on July 27th, that's prior to our current discussion point of July 1st, 2025, important for the timeline.
Got it.
She stated that declarations with 10 major trading partners would be coming soon, potentially even before July 8th, with other deals possibly finalized by September 1st.
Okay, so that sounds like negotiation is possible.
Right. This specific statement, according to our sources, suggested a pathway for active negotiation, potential agreement, perhaps even some relief. It painted a picture of ongoing diplomatic engagement, the possibility of a structured resolution.
Right.
But then you have President Trump, on the other hand, offering a starkly contrasting stance, stating clearly on July 9th that there would be absolutely no extensions whatsoever.
No extensions. Full stop.
Full stop. He simply said that tariffs would be notified to countries, implying a unilateral decision with no further room for negotiation.
Wow. So completely different signals.
Completely different. This immediately raises a critically important question, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. When you have key figures at the highest levels sending such dramatically different signals, how on earth do you even begin to formulate a cohesive, confident negotiation strategy as a trading partner?
You can't.
It's like trying to play high-stakes chess when the board pieces keep inexplicably moving or the rules are announced mid-match.
Exactly.
This direct divergence in messaging creates immense paralyzing pressure and uncertainty for any negotiating partner.
Yeah.
How do you prepare? Do you push hard for a deal, hoping that Raimondo's view prevails? Or do you brace for the inevitable impact of tariffs, assuming Trump's statement holds?
It leaves countries in this terrifying state of indecision.
Totally. Unsure whether to invest precious time, political capital, in talks that might be rendered moot, or to immediately prepare for punitive tariffs, potentially harming their own economies in the process. This kind of strategic ambiguity, whether it's intentional or not, becomes a powerful, almost coercive negotiating tool in itself.
It's abundantly clear from our sources that striking these deals, especially under these conditions, is incredibly difficult. And there are several fundamental obstacles embedded within the negotiation process itself.
Beyond the mixed messages.
Beyond the mixed messages. First, let's talk about the sheer, almost impossible time constraints.
Yeah, 6 or 7 days, you said.
Just 6 to 7 days from now until that critical July 8th deadline. Yet, according to our sources, detailed discussions for incredibly complex issues involving intricate trade agreements, sensitive economic sectors were, in many cases, just beginning to unfold.
Just starting. That's crazy.
Reaching comprehensive, mutually beneficial agreements in such a ridiculously short time frame is an almost impossible ask. It really raises fundamental questions about the U.S.'s genuine expectations here.
Are they really seeking a deal?
Or is this a tactic to force a specific outcome? Think about it. A typical trade agreement can take years, sometimes decades, of meticulous negotiation, legal drafting, political maneuvering.
Yeah.
To compress that into a single week, it's unprecedented and inherently challenging.
And it's not just about the merciless ticking of the clock, right? It's also about the intense global competition these nations face.
Good point.
ASEAN countries aren't negotiating in a vacuum, isolated from other global players. They're effectively competing with larger, more established trading partners. Think Japan, Canada.
Right, who have more leverage, maybe.
Often possess significantly greater economic leverage, deeper diplomatic ties, existing more complex trade relationships with the U.S. And the U.S., our sources reveal, is engaged in simultaneous negotiations with many countries.
Spreading themselves thin.
Which means the attention, diplomatic resources, political capital available for each individual negotiation are stretched incredibly thin. This inherently puts smaller, less economically dominant economies at a distinct disadvantage.
Yeah, they get lost in the shuffle.
They vie for limited attention, attempt to secure favorable terms in an already crowded and fiercely competitive field. In many respects, it can feel like a zero-sum game, where one country's hard-won gain in tariff relief might implicitly mean another country faces a tougher deal, simply due to the finite capacity and political bandwidth of the U.S. negotiators.
And what's truly striking and, well, kind of unfortunate is that this isn't just competition on the global stage. Our sources highlight a significant layer of intra-regional competition as well.
Within ASEAN itself.
Yeah. Even within the ASEAN bloc, countries are, perhaps reluctantly, competing against each other to secure the most favorable deal from the U.S. Our sources highlighted a very specific and telling example. Cambodia's vital textile industry needing to watch Vietnam with extreme vigilance. The underlying fear is palpable. If Vietnam, a major regional competitor in textiles and manufacturing, manages to secure a better tariff deal with the U.S., it could significantly disadvantage Cambodian production costs.
Making Cambodian goods instantly less competitive.
Exactly. Less competitive on the global market. This kind of internal pressure within the bloc, where a win for one can potentially be a loss for another, adds yet another layer of complexity to an already challenging high-stakes negotiation environment.
Wow.
It creates a dynamic where regional solidarity might be tested by national self-interest, especially when, livelihoods are literally at stake.
And perhaps the most significant and delicate obstacle, the one that truly transforms these negotiations into that tightrope walk you hear about, is the pervasive China factor.
Yes, the elephant in the room.
Pretty much. For most, if not all, ASEAN nations, China functions as an undeniable dual economic powerhouse. Not just a colossal trading partner, but also an enormous, crucial investor across various sectors, infrastructure, manufacturing, you name it.
Right, they're deeply intertwined.
Incredibly, this creates an extremely delicate balancing act for these countries. On one hand, they're desperate to secure favorable trade terms and maintain strong economic ties with the U.S., a vital export market. On the other, they simply cannot afford to alienate their massive economic partner in Beijing, given China's immense leverage and critical role in their supply chains, their economic development.
Caught between a rock and a hard place.
Absolutely. Our sources explicitly detail how the U.S., particularly under President Trump's administration, is exerting considerable pressure on these countries to reduce their reliance on Chinese supply chains, to align more closely with U.S. economic interests.
Which puts them in an almost impossible position.
Caught between trying to satisfy the demands of both economic superpowers while simultaneously protecting their own deeply intertwined national interests and maintaining their economic stability. It's a geopolitical minefield, truly, where every economic decision has profound political repercussions.
It's precisely that tightrope walk that makes this so much more than just a trade negotiation. It really is about navigating a geopolitical minefield, where interests are fundamentally at odds, and trying to make everyone happy is simply, well, an impossible dream. And within this complex China factor, there's a crucial, highly granular, and often contentious issue. The matter of circumvention, or more formally, rules of origin.
Ah, okay. This is critical.
It really is. The U.S. is extraordinarily focused on ensuring that goods exported from ASEAN nations genuinely originate there, with substantial local content, significant value addition within the country.
They want stuff just passing through.
Exactly. They are determined that these aren't just rebranded Chinese products attempting to sidestep existing tariffs. Our sources explicitly cite specific examples.
Like what?
Imagine Chinese manufacturers shipping semi-finished goods or components to countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, or Thailand. These goods might then undergo just a minimal final assembly, or maybe just get restamped with a Made in Vietnam or Made in Cambodia label
And then shipped to the U.S.
before being shipped to the U.S. market, effectively trying to bypass the tariffs specifically levied on direct Chinese imports. This practice, often called transshipment or tariff hopping,
Yeah, I've heard this term.
is something the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and trade enforcement agencies are actively, intensely scrutinizing. It's not enough to simply change a label.
No.
Companies must now invest heavily in rigorous documentation, supply chain transparency, demonstrating true local content and value addition. The burden of proof falls squarely on the exporter.
And the penalties if caught.
Severe. Ranging from immediate seizure of goods, retroactive tariffs, to blacklisting, which would just destroy a company's ability to export to the U.S. altogether. It adds an immense layer of complexity and risk, pushing companies to radically rethink their entire global manufacturing footprint.
Yeah, this intense focus on rules of origin speaks to a much deeper mistrust, doesn't it? And a fundamental desire by the U.S. to enforce not just the letter, but the very spirit of its trade policies.
Seems like it.
It means that simply shifting a final assembly line or applying a new stamp isn't nearly enough to satisfy the requirements. Companies, they must demonstrably prove true value addition, an authentic, verifiable supply chain connection to avoid accusations of circumvention.
Which adds a huge burden.
A significant, often costly burden on manufacturers and exporters in ASEAN. They must now invest heavily in establishing robust traceability systems, maybe using blockchain even.
Wow.
Ensuring meticulous documentation, sometimes fundamentally restructuring their entire production processes to comply. The stakes are incredibly high. Being caught in such a circumvention scheme could result in even more severe penalties, potentially even criminal charges in some cases,
Right.
and a complete breakdown of trust in those trade relations for years to come. This transforms the seemingly dry topic of trade rules into a critical operational and compliance challenge for every company involved.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to a concrete case study. One that acts as a powerful precedent, maybe a stark warning for other nations tangled in these tariff negotiations. The U.S.-Japan stalemate.
Ah, yes, Japan.
Yeah.
Major player.
A major player. Our sources, particularly a revealing Nikkei Asia report from July 2nd, 2025, indicate that President Trump is actively considering imposing exceptionally high tariffs, potentially ranging from 30% to 35%, on a significant portion of Japanese imports.
30 to 35% on Japan. That's huge.
Huge! This isn't just a speculative threat. It's presented as a very real, imminent possibility, backed by expert analysis of the administration's posture, the stated reasons.
Let me guess. Cars. Agriculture.
You got it. Classic, almost historical trade issues that have long plagued U.S.-Japan relations, namely Japan's perceived reluctance to import more U.S. agricultural products, specifically rice.
Rice. Always rice.
Always rice. And the persistent, long-standing trade imbalance, particularly concerning automobiles. These are not new sticking points. They're familiar battlegrounds.
Decades old, some of them.
Exactly. The very fact that these classic issues are resurfacing with such aggressive tariff threats highlights the administration's willingness to use maximum leverage.
And what's truly fascinating here, and really a core insight, is the consistent, aggressive use of deadlines as a leverage tool.
Right back to the deadlines.
Right back to them.
Yeah.
It raises that crucial question again. Is this just hard-nosed negotiation, or is it a calculated strategy to force immediate, significant concessions, regardless of the potential long-term damage to the trade relationship? In this specific U.S.-Japan context, we see the concept of reciprocal tariffs playing out once more, but with potentially devastating effect. If the U.S. perceives that Japan maintains high barriers to its agricultural goods, like rice, it might retaliate with similar level tariffs on crucial Japanese exports, like automobiles. a sector absolutely vital to the Japanese economy and also a significant employer in the U.S., by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. The impact would be severe.
Severe on both economies, potentially, particularly for the automobile industry. If a deal isn't reached by that critical July 9th deadline, for Japan, it means a massive hit to one of its flagship industries, impacting production, employment, export revenues. For the U.S., while maybe aiming to boost domestic production, it could lead to higher car prices for consumers, disruption in the auto supply chain, which is highly integrated globally.
It's all connected.
It underscores the extremely high stakes involved and the immense potential for significant economic disruption, not just for the targeted country, but for the global economy if these negotiations fail.
Yeah.
The Japan situation is a powerful signal. If a major economic power like Japan, with its long history of alliance, sophisticated trade infrastructure, faces such an aggressive approach, what does that imply for other nations?
Right. It signals that no one is immune.
No country, regardless of economic size, political alignment, established relationships, is immune to these pressures or the potential for such disruptive trade actions.
So for you, our listener, here's the critical parallel to draw. If a major economic power like Japan, with its significant negotiating clout, its deeply integrated economy with the U.S., its decades-long history of alliance, faces such challenging and potentially punitive trade actions, what does that truly imply for other nations? Especially for those in Southeast Asia, many of whom might have less economic leverage, more volatile internal political situations, or economies that are far more susceptible to external shocks.
It's a chilling thought for them.
It sends an unmistakable signal that no country, regardless of its economic size or the depth of its established relationships, is beyond the reach of these trade pressures. The Japanese experience serves as a stark warning, indicating the potential outcomes when negotiations falter. And it underscores the absolute criticality for all countries involved to proactively and strategically adapt.
It truly illustrates the blunt force of these trade instruments when wielded with such intent. If even Japan, a nation with immense manufacturing prowess and a highly organized trade apparatus, is under such intense pressure, facing the prospect of 30–35% tariffs on its key exports, it highlights the immense difficulty and the extremely limited room for maneuver that other nations possess. This U.S.-Japan situation acts as a stark, almost undeniable blueprint for what could unfold elsewhere.
A blueprint, yeah.
It emphasizes the need for unprecedented agility and preparedness for all countries currently engaged in these high-stakes negotiations. The consequences of miscalculation or inaction are simply too severe to contemplate. It indicates that nations must now factor in trade policy as a primary, not secondary, driver of economic risk and strategic planning.
It's not just about tariffs anymore.
No, it's about a fundamental shift in the global trade paradigm.
So, given this incredibly complex and profoundly uncertain environment, strategic adaptations are no longer optional for companies, for investors. They are, quite simply, an absolute necessity for survival, for sustained growth.
You have to adapt or well.
Exactly. From a corporate strategy perspective, firms are actively pursuing aggressive supply chain diversification. This means systematically spreading their manufacturing, sourcing, even R&D across multiple countries and regions, explicitly to reduce dependence on any single origin that might suddenly become subject to punitive tariffs or other trade barriers.
Not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Precisely. For instance, a company might have traditionally relied on one large factory in China. Now they're strategically investing in new production facilities in Mexico, maybe Vietnam, maybe even establishing parallel lines back in their home country, creating a more resilient, albeit more complex and costly, global footprint.
And beyond mere diversification, another absolutely critical adaptation is that meticulous compliance with rules of origin.
Back to that again.
It's crucial.
It's absolutely crucial. Companies are investing heavily, often millions, in ensuring their products meet stringent, increasingly complex rules of origin requirements. This is no minor detail. It is vital to prove genuine local content and to unequivocally avoid any accusations of circumvention, which, as we've discussed, is a major high-stakes concern for the U.S.
So what does that involve practically?
It means implementing sophisticated traceability systems, maybe using blockchain to track components from raw material to finished product, hiring dedicated compliance teams, meticulously documenting every single step of the manufacturing process to satisfy auditors.
Wow, that's a huge undertaking. It is. Furthermore, businesses are becoming far more proactive in their advocacy and direct engagement. They are working hand in glove with their respective governments, trade bodies, even forming industry coalitions to advocate for favorable negotiation outcomes or to seek specific exemptions for their particular products or sectors.
Trying to influence the outcome.
They understand that their detailed input can be crucial in shaping the trade landscape and mitigating the risks to their operations. This is no longer just about optimizing production. It's about strategic lobbying and regulatory mastery.
So if you're an investor, you're looking far beyond just quarterly earnings reports or traditional market fundamentals now.
Way beyond.
You are now meticulously scrutinizing how well companies are adapting to this incredibly complex, multi-layered, and constantly shifting trade environment. It's fundamentally about resilience and foresight. Investors are increasingly analyzing company exposure to high tariff sectors and countries. They're not just looking at where a company sells, but where it sources and where it manufactures.
The whole value chain.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
They're also deeply analyzing how companies' various hedging strategies, whether it's currency hedging, supply chain diversification, strategic partnerships, joint ventures, how those are specifically designed to mitigate the inherent risks posed by tariffs.
Does the company have a plan B, basically?
Exactly. Is there a plan B? It isn't just about absorbing direct tariff costs. It's about the systemic risk that tariffs introduce to entire business models and long-term growth prospects. This heightened risk calculation also profoundly impacts M&A, mergers, and acquisitions.
Right.
And overall foreign direct investment, FDI, flows globally. Companies, understandably, might hesitate to invest in or acquire businesses in regions highly susceptible to tariff uncertainty, choosing instead to shift their capital to less exposed areas, even if those areas maybe offer lower initial returns. It creates a reordering of global capital flows where geopolitical risk and trade policy stability become paramount considerations.
Indeed. It introduces an entirely new dimension to traditional risk assessment. It elevates geopolitical stability, trade policy predictability to a status as important as, if not more critical than, conventional market fundamentals like revenue growth or profit margins.
Wow.
The investment community is now hyper-aware of these often subtle yet powerful nuances. And the very structure of global capital flows can be significantly influenced, even fundamentally reshaped, by shifts in tariff policies and the perceived political will behind them.
So capital flows towards certainty.
Capital, by its nature, seeks certainty and stability. When those are compromised by unpredictable trade policies, it simply finds new avenues, often to the detriment of the initially targeted regions. This dynamic can lead to a kind of economic flight to quality, where capital moves away from riskier, tariff-exposed areas.
Okay, adding to these already immense complexities are significant challenges within the negotiation process itself, often compounded by internal political vulnerabilities within the very countries attempting to strike these deals.
Domestic politics interfering.
Exactly. Our sources analyze that many ASEAN countries, despite the high stakes, are coming to the table with surprisingly generic offers to the U.S.
Generic? How so?
Well, we're seeing a recurring pattern of what our sources call 5 common offers being put forward. These include things like reducing agricultural import taxes on U.S. products.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
Implementing stricter controls on counterfeit goods to protect U.S. IP.
Also seems standard.
Pledging to purchase more U.S. products, like commitments to buy more liquefied natural gas from Alaska, for example. Or even, in some cases, offering to reduce their own exports to the U.S. in an attempt to balance trade figures.
So a basket of common concessions.
Right. But the core issue, as our sources explain, is that these 5 common offers, while seemingly reasonable, are often insufficient to meet the specific demands of the U.S.
Why is that?
Well, the U.S., particularly under President Trump's approach, often seeks something special, something uniquely tailored or strategically significant from each individual partner, something beyond that generic basket of concessions.
They want something unique from each country.
Exactly. This dynamic leads to prolonged, incredibly difficult, and often frustrating negotiations because a standardized offer simply doesn't cut it. It forces this painstaking, often uncomfortable process of trying to identify that one unique, politically palatable concession that might genuinely satisfy the U.S. demands and unlock a deal.
It's a game of finding the ultimate, often painful, differentiator.
Precisely. And sometimes a country's own internal dynamics can fundamentally hobble its bargaining power at the absolute worst possible moment.
Like the Thai example.
The Thai example, highlighted so starkly in our sources, is a perfect illustration of this. At a truly critical juncture, just as the Thai negotiation team led by Mr. Pichai was in Washington for high-level meetings with the USTR,
Yeah.
their prime minister, Patonkarn, was dramatically suspended from duty.
Wow. Right in the middle of talks.
Right in the middle. This immediately plunged the country into a state of profound political turmoil and uncertainty. With acting prime ministers like Surya and Funtham stepping in, there was significant immediate lack of clarity on who truly held the authority to make binding decisions, offer concessions, or ratify agreements on behalf of the nation.
This kind of internal instability, precisely at the moment of crucial international negotiations, profoundly weakens a country's hand, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
U.S. negotiators, operating in such an environment, would naturally question the credibility, the durability of any agreements reached. Who can they genuinely trust to honor commitments made by a government whose leadership is in constant flux?
You wouldn't know who to talk to.
Exactly. Who can the Thai negotiating team in Washington even consult for real-time authoritative decisions when their very leadership back home is in disarray? If the ultimate authority to sign off on a deal is suddenly in question, the perceived legitimacy and effectiveness of the negotiating team just evaporate. This case study starkly highlights how domestic political stability is not just an internal affair. It is a crucial, foundational determinant of a nation's effectiveness, its leverage, its ultimate success in navigating complex international trade negotiations.
A crisis at home translates directly,
Instantly and painfully into a weakened hand at the bargaining table, making favorable outcomes incredibly difficult to secure.
Another interesting contrast highlighted by our sources, which offers maybe a valuable lesson, is the difference between a slow and steady approach to negotiations versus a more proactive one.
Okay.
Thailand, for instance, initially adopted what could be described as a no-need-to-rush stance. They seemed to be strategically waiting, maybe observing what kind of outcome Vietnam would achieve. Vietnam was engaged in much earlier, more frequent rounds of negotiation.
So Thailand was waiting to see what Vietnam got.
Perhaps. Their thinking might have been to learn from Vietnam's experience before committing. Vietnam, on the other hand, pursued a far more aggressive and proactive strategy. They'd already engaged in 3 distinct rounds of high-level negotiations, even if a final comprehensive deal hasn't been reached yet.
So being proactive versus waiting, what's the implication?
Well, being at the end of the queue for these high-stakes negotiations, as Thailand found itself, meant significantly less opportunity for early wins or for meaningfully shaping the fundamental terms of engagement.
Ah, okay. You lose influence if you wait too long.
It's an inherent disadvantage compared to countries that engaged much earlier and were thus able to set precedents, influence the broader discussion parameters, maybe secure some initial concessions.
Right.
This underscores the absolute imperative for agility and proactive preparation, especially for smaller nations with less inherent leverage. The lesson from Japan, which we discussed earlier, vividly reiterates this point.
Yeah, if Japan struggles.
If even a major, technologically advanced economy like Japan, with its immense negotiating clout, struggles and faces such severe threats, then smaller nations truly need to be exceptionally agile, meticulously prepared, and relentlessly proactive to secure any semblance of favorable terms.
Mm-hmm.
In this incredibly high-stakes environment where deadlines loom and political winds can shift, delay can prove to be an extraordinarily costly strategy. It's a race against time, and those who hesitate often find themselves falling further behind.
Yeah, time is definitely not on their side here.
So as we bring this deep dive into the persistent threat of Trump-era tariffs to a close, let's zoom out and consider the macro perspective. Is this truly a ticking time bomb poised to explode across global markets? Or is it merely background noise, that persistent hum that the global economy will just learn to live with?
The million-dollar question.
Pretty much. For the immediate outlook, based on the conflicting signals we've heard from Washington, those incredibly tight looming deadlines, there is a strong, indeed, a very high probability that tariffs will be unilaterally imposed on many countries if comprehensive agreements aren't reached by those critical dates.
That seems like the default outcome almost.
The sources point to this as the default outcome in the absence of a breakthrough.
So in this immediate term, what are the best case scenarios? Are there any?
Well, They're somewhat limited. They would involve achieving some form of agreement, maybe imperfect, maybe partial, but something that would at least allow countries to avoid the highest, most damaging tariffs.
Damage limitation.
Damage limitation. Alternatively, a formal extension of the negotiation deadline could be granted. That would provide much needed time for these incredibly complex, politically charged discussions to unfold properly, perhaps in a less pressured environment.
But the worst case scenario.
The worst case scenario, which is a very real and present possibility if no agreement is struck and no extensions are granted, is the imposition of severe, crippling tariffs.
Oof.
This would lead to significant and immediate economic damage, especially for the most trade-dependent nations we've highlighted throughout this deep dive. This is precisely where the ticking time bomb aspect truly comes into play,
Yeah.
threatening to derail economic stability, trigger widespread job losses, fundamentally alter the economic trajectory for millions across these affected regions. It's a high-stakes gamble with profound human consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
But let's shift our perspective just a bit, beyond just the immediate direct impact of tariffs and their potential imposition. What's truly significant here, and what our sources consistently emphasize, is their broader long-term influence.
The structural shifts.
Exactly. The immense pressure stemming from these ongoing trade negotiations isn't just about short-term tariff rates or immediate disruptions to supply chains. It's actively accelerating a fundamental structural restructuring of economic relationships and global supply chains, particularly between the U.S. and Southeast Asia.
Right.
This isn't merely a bump in the road, it's a seismic, deliberate shift, pushing economies to fundamentally reconsider where and how they operate on a global scale. We're witnessing a kind of remapping of global commerce.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these aren't just isolated trade disputes. They're powerful catalysts for a fundamental realignment of global economic architecture itself. This persistent pressure is forcing countries, major companies, to critically reevaluate not just their global sourcing strategies, but their entire manufacturing footprints, their long-term trade partnerships.
Everything's on the table.
Everything. This could lead to a global economy that is, on one hand, perhaps more diversified, with production spread across a greater number of nations to mitigate risk. But on the other hand, it could also become significantly more fragmented, potentially giving rise to more distinct, regionalized economic blocs with fewer truly globalized, seamless supply chains. It raises an incredibly important question for our time. What does this mean for the concept of globalization itself, which has largely defined international commerce for decades?
Right. Is this the end of globalization as we knew it?
Are we witnessing the beginning of its profound redefinition, or maybe just a complex, painful evolution towards a new, more resilient, yet perhaps less integrated global economic order?
So here's something to mull over, something for you, our listener, to consider as you process this deep dive. As global trade faces these unprecedented pressures and potential restructuring, how will nations and indeed individual companies, even consumers, balance the undeniable need for economic security and stability, perhaps even national self-sufficiency, with the profound historically proven benefits of open markets, free trade, and global economic integration? What does this mean for economic resilience, and what is the future of free trade as you understand it?
It's a complex interplay, isn't it? Where that powerful drive for perceived national benefit often clashes directly with the deeply interconnected reality of the global economy.
Yeah.
The answer to that question will likely define the next era of international commerce, shaping not just balance sheets, but geopolitical relationships for decades to come.
A truly deep dive today into the complex currents and the undeniable forces shaping global trade right now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.